Having a robust security system in place and an expert with over 15 years of cybersecurity experience on team, you'd think you'd done enough to be safe. Yet as one software service company would soon learn, for the sophisticated criminal, there's no such thing as safe enough. This is the Cyber Crime Lab, a podcast about true cybercrime stories, the impact on victims, and what businesses can do to protect themselves and their customers. And if you think you're not at risk, that is exactly where attackers want you to be. Today, Andy has invited Luke Emrich, the Director of Incident Response at Tetra Defense, to the Cyber Crime Lab. However, Luke is not the victim of today's case, but rather the lead investigator.
So Luke, thanks so much for joining us on the Cyber Crime Lab podcast. I was really looking forward to this conversation because I know you've been doing this for a long time and helping folks kind of live through these incidents. So maybe for those who don't know your background, if you could just give a little bit of the background of what your role is and kind of your history of dealing with cyber incidents.
Sure. So my role at my current shop is I'm currently a case lead. So when an incident comes in, I'm one of the first people that the client will speak to, and we'll have a conversation about the event that's occurring. We'll work through a game plan and strategy as to how do we investigate the event, how do we recover, how do we get the business back up and running. So this is what I'm doing in my current role. In the past, I've kind of played a lot of different roles kind of in this space. Everything from forensic analyst, kind of all the way up to leading and building a practice and kind of doing the case lead role, all the way up. So I've been in the industry for about 10 years and I've seen a lot change. But at the same time, there's a lot that's still the same.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that we, as we talk about actual incidents and talk with the people who actually deal with them every day, so much of the stuff isn't hitting the news, right? It often looks very different, and particularly the size and the scale of the businesses that are getting hit. So, what would you say the sort of average size or look of the type of cases that you and the businesses that you're involved with are?
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question. I think in the news, we hear the big sexy ones, right? The Colonial Pipelines of the world that have gotten hit. But I think the reality is, and what a lot of people don't realize is a lot of time it is, the smaller, medium size, smaller business, maybe a mom and pop. And it really has a devastating impact on organizations of that type because they typically don't have the robust security programs and teams that some of the bigger organizations do. So, it's a challenge, right?
Totally. And I know, what's been fun is we were able to kind of have a little bit of a conversation with this around this particular case that we're going to focus on today. And, we're lucky enough to actually get some time with the actual, the victim who had lived through this, right? For obvious reasons, like much of this world, he wasn't able to actually join us because of some of the confidentiality issues. But I think I'd just love to dive into that case in particular because I think, the stats are always interesting to hear and scary often, but until you start to hear what a real case is like, it's not as real for folks, right? It doesn't kind of hit them the same way. So, if my memory serves me correctly, this is a company that's sort of in the medical, general sort of medical space, right?
Absolutely.
Dealing with stuff involving patients, et cetera. And so maybe from your memory, when did the case kick off? When did you first hear of it, and what was going on?
Yeah. So it actually, believe it or not, it was a Saturday night.
Isn't it always right? Does this ever happen on a Tuesday morning? Right?
No, it was like a Saturday night. I think I just finished up like a dinner date with, I'm pretty sure if timing's right, it's my wife. We kind of wrapped up a dinner date, and I think we were watching a
She's
movie.
checking the
and,
calendar. If it's recent and
Yeah.
it's not your wife, we might
Yeah.
have a different conversation. You have to have.
Yeah. So, I kind of get a phone call, 10 o'clock from a colleague of mine at work saying, hey, this client of mine is having, a pretty big problem, and I need some help. And I kind of told him, look, not tonight, call one of my peers. I'm the one that was always on call at my last shop, and I was taking this night off, type of thing. But
Yep.
So that's how it came in. And what we ended up advising is the client basically pull the plug and, start working through assessing, what is the impact of the event, and taking steps to contain it. Operations were a little bit different at my last shop, but the next morning, kind of is when things really ramped up, and we really kind of started, that dialogue with the client again, and really started working through figuring out what was going on, when did it start, what was happening, how can we help, and things like that.
Yeah, and so if I remember correctly, they got hit, and I think what was really profound about hearing about this was how, it's not, you often don't quite know what's going on, right? It's sort of like that fog of war effect where you think you might know some things, but you're not really sure. Do you remember for this particular case what that was like? Trying to understand how far this went, and I know it was sort of, if I'm remembering correctly, it was sort of like a mix of their sort of production environment and then maybe also corporate stuff as well. What do you remember?
Yeah. So, the client actually in this case had a fairly robust security program, and was able to kind of quickly assess the impact of the event, and how, not necessarily how it was carried out, but what systems were down and what systems were impacted. And it became pretty clear very early on that there were three separate and what they thought were completely distinct networks, different domains, different, not even really subnets, different domains that were all impacted. And it seemed like it had happened kind of very quickly. A lot of the attack was carried out in the evening hours, while, the client didn't necessarily have eyes on keyboards and screens, and, weren't acting to actively protect their network. It was kind of easy hunting for them at that point.
Yeah, and for someone who's not as technical as you, right? Essentially, that means, separate domains means that they were pretty, literally like separate websites and whole networks, right? Like things that aren't, easily touching each other. I mean, there are connections sometimes, but it's not as though, normally you would see flow, and normally you wouldn't see an issue spill from one to the next, right?
Yeah, I mean, you could even consider these as like three different houses in a neighborhood, and how did the burglar get in all of these houses? That's probably a good way to kind of simplify it.
Yeah, and that's just a sign of like essentially the sophistication of this attack, and the fact that it was so well sort of planned and executed, right? And the fact that it happened at a time when, Saturday, right? And and often attackers use those sort of times when there's, the night watchman is there instead of the full security staff.
Yeah, and I don't even know if I would call it the sophistication. I mean, they were using some tools that we can talk about a little bit more, but the tools made their job pretty easy, I think.
Yeah.
And the tool found a way for them to kind of jump in these kind of houses, as I've talked about it. So
yeah, I know. We've had some conversations about that, right? And they're, we actually had a conversation with one of the builders of one of those tools. Who's he's above board. This is a a white hat hacker, someone who's on the good guy side, but with the realization that some of those tools can be used for creating issues as well, and used by criminals as well. But I think and then right, so decently put together attack, and again, this organization, right? Just to give people a flavor of it. Were, hundreds of employees? How big were they relative size? Do you remember?
I think they were probably hundreds of employees, but because of the way that one of their products was used, they actually provided almost like a software as a service. So as you kind of spider out, one of the environments that was impacted now starts impacting, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of kind of downstream individuals.
Yeah.
I don't know if I want to call them clients. Yeah. I don't want to, probably not hundreds of thousands of organizations,
Yeah.
but
And I think we will, we're not going to be getting too close to revealing kind of the client, but this was, space touching lots of medical environments. So, you had lots of doctors and nurses and, service providers and whatnot getting impacted, right? Because it was sitting and touching a lot of those different environments, right? Not, and not to the level of probably, equipment going down kind of level, right? Like this wasn't controlling like the the breathing pumps and and heart rate monitors and all of that sort of stuff, but it was still not good, right? And certainly impacting those organizations and their environments. And again, mostly that this is not a household name. This is not a Fortune, even 2,000 company. I mean, it's hundreds of employees, but it's solidly a medium-sized business. Wouldn't even call it sub enterprise. Okay, so starts to hit all these environments, and then what do you guys, how do you get? So Sunday morning, you wake up and you're starting to kind of dig in on it. What happens?
Yeah, so a lot of times in these investigations, you have to kind of start at some of the high value systems or systems that we believe, the threat actor may have really used as part of their attack, and how was it carried out. And a lot of the times that means, let's start at a domain controller. It's kind of the keys to the kingdom are kind of stored there in a lot of environments. Let's go look there and see what we see. And the threat actor in this case kind of used a slightly different tactic than we see very often. They kind of used a technique where they used one system that they would then push out a tool called Cobalt Strike, so kind of a backdoor to some subset of systems past that point. So we then go from one computer affected or that they are able to control to maybe 5, right? And then from those 5 computer systems, they pushed Cobalt Strike, the same tool, out to maybe 5 or 10 more computers per system. So you can see how this would exponentially grow pretty quickly. Yeah. And it was a kind of a slightly different tactic. In the past, we often see that they'll use one centralized system, to push a deployment of ransomware out. In this case, they pushed Cobalt Strike from one system to many more and kind of exponentially on, and then use that Cobalt Strike to then drop the ransomware. So from a forensics perspective, looking at each one of these systems, the artifacts were pretty limited. Basically, there's a specific artifact that we would look for evidence that Cobalt Strike was introduced to the system. And then we really didn't see any other use other than the deployment of ransomware.
Yeah.
But what we would want to look for was, where did the Cobalt Strike installation, where did the program come from? How did it get there? How did the bad guy put it there? So we would go look at another artifact that would point back to the prior system. Where did that come from? And as we started analyzing, it kind of became clear to us that this was the mechanism. This was kind of the deployment path that the threat actor used, and that we needed to kind of follow this path backwards in order to figure out, one, how did they get into the network? When did this start, and where did it start? And how did they get from the different domains? How did they migrate between them? Because they should have been separate. There were not usernames and passwords that we knew about that overlapped between them. So
yeah, and for somebody who, as you say that, it just reminds me a lot. I mean, obviously we're all living in the sort of post-COVID or hopefully post, right? Maybe still in the back half of COVID, and this sounds a lot like, you know, tracing back the spread, right, and tracing
Exactly.
infections, right, and who touched who and how complicated that gets, right? Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
That's a terrible but great analogy, when you think about it that way. I guess I haven't thought about it that way. But, in this particular one, the thing that I forgot about, and this added to the challenge and the delay of the actual investigation, is that part of the steps that the threat actor started taking more so later on, is that they started clearing the security and system and many of the event logs on the computer system.
and is that
So
so they were like sort of basically like sweeping up their tracks as they went, and were they doing that? Like, were you seeing this like as you're investigating, they're like changing up their tactics, or was this something that they just were kind of getting more as they got more control over the systems, they could do that better? Is that
we almost noticed it was kind of, our investigation kind of starts at, some point in time and goes backwards.
Mhm.
And actually it almost seems like as we went further back, that tactic kind of started dissolving. So the further back or the earlier in the time frame that we got, we saw less and less event log clearing. So it was kind of, it seemed like it was a rush to figure out what was up, in the environment. As soon as a threat actor gains access to a network, they don't immediately know where everything is. It's kind of like the idea of, if I went into the front door of a stranger's house, like, I don't know the floor plan of the house.
yeah,
I
yeah.
don't know where, the safe is and where the valuables might be. The threat actor kind of needs to do the same thing and figure that out in the network, and also kind of needs to figure out that floor plan in some ways,
Yeah.
of the network. So I think early on it was more so, let's focus on and figure out what's the floor plan of the network, where are the systems, where
Yeah.
might the valuable important systems be. And they were a little bit loud, and a little less destructive kind of in that side of the house. But once they started getting a better understanding of where they were, and where the systems were and where they were kind of spreading out more, they kind of tried to take steps to cover their tracks so that they weren't
Yeah.
as
And
easy to
I
follow.
mean, this is what's fun, right? Like thinking about what this actually looks like. But let's just take a step back, and because I remember talking with this individual, and maybe we should just give him a name, right? Like, let's just call him Joe, right?
Okay.
Joe, security guy, right? Just so right. So Joe, I remember it from this call distinctly how, sort of in shock Joe was, right? Because I remember he, like, you were back from a dinner date and said, "Oh, I gotta, I can't handle it," and your team was picking up some stuff, but literally he was, described sort of going down into his, spare bedroom and spending the next basically all night kind of dealing with this, thinking about this, like running around trying to figure out what was going on with him and his team, and some outside folks as well, and how, you know, sort of right out of the box, it's sort of like you were involved in like a train wreck and kind of like trying to pick up
Yeah.
from that, right? Um,
Yeah.
is that pretty common where you just like, you feel like you've been just like hit by a Mack truck when you're one of these IT folks at a organization?
Yes. But it's different levels of car crash, in that scenario, right? It's Joe and his company did a lot of planning and preparation for this type of thing, and it's really unfortunate that planning and preparation didn't prevent or didn't catch this early enough um, to stop it before it escalated. But that being said, yes, it was chaos in the kind of early hours of the investigation, that the first, kind of day two,
Yeah.
but all of that planning and preparation actually worked out really kind of amazing, because the incident response team that I was working on at the time and his team pretty quickly kind of started working lockstep with each other, where we were sharing information. We were really working hand in hand, not only in the response, but also even the investigation. So one of the challenges that we ran into, and I described this, is the threat actor starts clearing these logs, which makes it very difficult for us to understand where the previous step was. Where was the threat actor before they infected and compromised this system? And one of the pieces of preparation that the organization did is they set up a backup program that was extremely granular. They were backing up their systems every single hour, most every system in their environment. So what we did is, as we kind of started figuring out, as we triage a system to figure out when was it compromised, where was the previous step coming from, we were able to share that with the client team, and basically their team and our team were kind of going through a variety of different workstations, servers in the environment, and almost kind of picking one spot and saying, when was the system impacted? Is it earlier than what we already know? Is it later?
Right. You could go back.
Let's just try to go back as far as we can.
Yeah.
And I think we spent quite a bit of time, kind of chasing that backwards. And when we got to a roadblock, we then fell back to the backup and said, hey, we're hitting a roadblock. The event logs are cleared on this system, what have you. Let's pull the backup and go see what we see in the last backup before this activity. And that was incredibly helpful. And it allowed us to kind of track the activity back a lot farther in the environment. Yeah.
And I think, I remember some of these conversations with Joe, and he was talking about actually, not to jump too far into the story, but as they started to figure out what may have caused this, right, that it actually was touching some of the legacy stuff, that this organization had been maintaining some legacy stuff for business reasons, right? The whole security team had essentially identified, hey, this is a problem, right? This stuff is unsupported and it's got known vulnerabilities and blah, blah, blah. But, the company was facing that really, it's that challenging thing that we don't want to rock the boat with any of our customers. And if we move away from some of this legacy stuff, we're essentially going to force the customers to upgrade and change, and that, that could create impacts on revenue. Will that customer churn if they, if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of, on the relationship side. And so it was like, they'd all identified this, right? And so, and then they thought they'd put in some of the, good controls to sort of mitigate and limit it, right? But then realized that, oh gosh, that potential vulnerability in the system had not been fully isolated, right? And so they were able to get in and then move from it, right? So
that kind of goes back to the houses we talked about, right? So the primary part of our investigation initially was focused on the corporate domain. Because that's where the real important and sensitive data was. But to your point, there was a separate domain that had some of these kind of legacy protocols that were in it, and they purposely separated it into a different domain and kind of a different computing environment to separate it from some of the other assets that were important to the business. I kind of remember as we're working through this process of like all hands on deck reviewing these couple indicators of compromise that we're looking for, there was kind of like an aha or eureka moment where I don't even know what time it was, probably that Monday night, Tuesday night at 8, 9, 10 o'clock. We're still working almost nonstop through this, and I don't know why it didn't dawn on somebody earlier, but I'm like, hey, do we have any antivirus detections that we need to focus in on? And one of the security engineers for the organization said, I don't know, hold on, let me go take a look. So quickly come back and they say, well, there was this detection for Bloodhound. And I'm like, and we didn't really know what it was. So we didn't really think about this. And I knew exactly what Bloodhound was. Bloodhound is a vulnerability testing, not necessarily vulnerability testing, but a domain enumeration tool, kind of a reconnaissance tool that we see many of the threat actors use. And I knew that that was a bad sign. And I asked them, where was this detection? And they said, well, it's actually on our antivirus server. It's kind of our centrally managed antivirus server, and this kind of, we were scratching our head why this went off there, but we didn't really know. And I described the capabilities of the tool and what it was used for. And they were like, oh my God, because in one of their environments, there were local administrative credentials that were being used. I think this was in the kind of legacy environment. And those credentials should have been changed when a new computer system was provisioned. However, on that antivirus server that bridged the different domains, the different kind of environments, it was not changed. So the threat actor was able to find that password in that legacy kind of environment, and they were able to try it against that antivirus server. And that allowed them kind of the jumping point to go from one domain to the other.
Right.
And that was a huge point for us. And that's kind of like what I was talking about earlier. Once we stepped back into that legacy environment, it was much easier to perform that investigation because this was prior to the threat actor clearing logs. Their tactics were in steps that they took were very much the same, but they weren't clearing the logs every step of the way.
Yeah. And you describing that, right? Like, I mean, just fun, interesting details, but like this went on for days, right? And Joe was telling us about how, gosh, like, that first night he barely sleeps, but then it's going on, and his notes were incredible because I remember asking him, like, gosh, why do you have such good notes? He's like, oh, well, the entire company staff basically was told to, we're shut. We can't do anything. So it was just the security and engineering team and basically like the C-suite, right? Like of the company, right? Couple hundred person company. So, all sort of in a war room, and he was having to report on what was going, I think every 3 hours or something crazy like that. Right.
Yeah.
So for just, days and days and days, just like trying to figure out what's going on. And then was there a ransom being demanded, or what was happening kind of with the threat actor on the side? Like, was there ever any sense of, gosh, we're just going to pay this ransom, or what's going on that side?
Yeah, my focus at the time was really more on the investigation. We didn't really get involved in kind of the ransom note side of it and what was done with that. But to your previous point, yeah, I mean, talking about the timeline, we had that initial call on a Saturday night, as I mentioned. We, as a team, collectively narrowed in on what we believed was root point of compromise on Friday. So the following Friday, I guess 6 days later. And it was about 7 p.m. at that time. And we had all been working, they were working nonstop around the clock. And, we had a couple, different rounds of people working on it on our end. But I remember when we narrowed in and said, hey, we're really comfortable with what root point of compromise is on that Friday night. Joe and I talked about this, but we didn't share it with the broader group. But Joe and I kind of decided it's time to shut it down for the night. Let's all go get some rest. Let's come back with, some fresh eyes, Saturday morning. There was a little bit of kind of loose ends that we worked on wrapping up. But then we were able to go back to the business probably around noon, 1 o'clock on that Saturday, and tell them we are confident we've found root point of compromise. And we know when the attack started and the timeline of the attack and how it was carried out. We talked about having really, strong granular backups of everything. And now that we knew when root point of compromise was, not only how the threat actor got in, but when they got in, we felt confident that we could start the process of falling back to those backups to restore and really restore business operations. So
Right. Because
that's always a tricky
yeah.
point.
Walk us through like why that's so important, right? Because I don't think people who don't do this every day feel like why is it so important to go through kind of this deep forensic dive and understand what was the first thing touched? I mean, what are the potential alternatives to kind of knowing that, and what are the different pathways that might happen for an
Yeah, I
organization?
mean, when you go through a cyber attack, a ransomware attack specifically, I think a lot of people think that it's just malware. Like somebody's clicked on a link and it's downloaded the malware in the environment, and that's how our systems got infected and encrypted. And the reality is that may have been ransomware, kind of circa 2016, 2017, but that's not ransomware today. Ransomware today is there's a threat actor or an adversary that has gained access to your network. They've done a lot of reconnaissance. They've kind of learned where all your systems are. They've probably learned what your username and passwords are in your environment. And if you don't figure out how they got in, you can go through all the steps to get your business back up and running if you've got backups per se. But allow the threat actor to kind of come right back and come back in and do it all over again. And maybe it's not even that same threat actor group. We see many of the threat actor groups, the different ransomware groups, using the same tactics and techniques to get in. So you may deal with a Conti this week, and you might be dealing with a Black Cat next week. Making sure that you understand the full timeline of the attack and how the threat actor got in, and then coming up with a game plan and strategy to not only clean up, but to take remedial actions to make sure it doesn't happen again is incredibly important.
Yeah, and I think if I'm remembering correctly, Joe was telling us how he was like, basically like it was a call between, having to completely rebuild from scratch one of those production environments, which for those who don't do that on a daily basis, that would have been potentially like months of work, right?
Yeah.
Versus, if you can figure out when this started and you can restore from a backup, you're almost back up to normal, right? Obviously, you've been down for a while, but it's not going to be that sort of level, right? But that obviously it's not even just this organization, right? They were impacting all of their clients, and so that sort of that moment of you tell your clients, oh gosh, we fixed this, and then you can start operating again, and then a huge, potentially hugely damaging if you tell them that and then things all go down again because the threat actor that you were wrong. So it's that sort of, but the other potential prospect is you're down for months, right? Like those are very different you know total business impacts, right, in terms of it, right?
Yeah. And another thing too is, I find that I regularly have to educate my clients that when you go through this type of event, even if you have backups, it's not going to come back overnight. I had a call just 2 days ago where we asked the question of a client, have you ever tested your backups? And they said, yeah, we had to restore one of our servers, and it took a day and a half to restore the server. And they're like, well, we need to get back up and running like yesterday after a ransomware attack, completely separate and than the one we're talking about right now. But every server in their environment was impacted, not just one. So you need to start thinking about, disk IO, what is the performance of your systems? What is the bandwidth? Maybe you've got offline backups or cloud backups. You've got to download those. You're looking at do you have room to store all of that? We always want to balance forensics and getting business back up and running, but do you have enough storage in your environment to not destroy the systems that we want to analyze and also start working on restoring business operations? There's a lot of variables that come into play that a lot of organizations probably never thought about when kind of scaling their equipment and what are they buying. But how does that what's the timeline to get it back up and running? It's not a day. We're not talking days. We're talking weeks, and in some case months.
One of the things I think was just like how I was really struck when Joe was telling us how sort of emotionally intense this was, right? Like it was, I mean, this guy was ex-military and he was like, this is the craziest thing I've ever been involved with. It's like the most searingly intense, right? I don't know if he did like, hardcore combat, but the fact that this was like right near the top of the stack in terms of craziness. Is that what you find a lot, Luke? Like, is this, just like so emotionally um, difficult for the people that are involved?
Yeah, I think definitely from the client perspective, it does impact everybody differently. You think of the small to medium sized business, and you think about the owner. That this is everything that they've put their blood, sweat, and tears into for how many years. Then you got somebody like Joe, who's kind of the security professional that has kind of hung his hat on trying to protect and trying to get the organization to buy into everything to prevent, this type of attack. And yeah, I mean, it's catastrophic in every single situation. Kind of some of the things that I've heard and kind of come out at the wash in the end of some of our investigations is, how are you, Luke, or Tetra team or whatnot, so calm and collected as you're working through this engagement, and through this process? It's terrible to go through. And I think the answer, unfortunately, is you go through it so many times that you kind of become numb to it, to the emotion of it. Obviously, we want to do everything in our power to help our clients kind of back up to speed and recover as quickly as possible. But yeah.
And I think maybe just in the last few minutes that we have, right? I think let's talk about what this, I mean, it sounds like this organization was prepared, right? That's what's so like bananas, right? Like they, they had a good team. They'd been thinking about this sort of stuff, right? And,
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, had they not, you probably could have been even worse, right? Because they were down a week plus, but could have been potentially months, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what would you recommend, like having seeing as much as you do what this is like?
Yeah. I mean, I think it starts with, having a robust security program, and developing a incident response plan that kind of calls out how to act, when to act. I think another important piece is vulnerability management and patching. In the last year, as we were doing, our investigations last year, we did nearly 800 ransomware investigations. Out of those 800 investigations here, it was something like 80% of the investigations that we did started with the Exchange vulnerability being the initial root point of compromise. And following that were a number of vulnerabilities in VPNs, and so knowing what are those kind of critical vulnerabilities that threat actors are kind of going after, and exploiting in environments. I know Log4j earlier this year was, a really hot button conversation. We didn't really see a whole lot of intrusions start with Log4j, but it also kind of reminds me of when the initial Exchange vulnerability came out. When that vulnerability came out, we didn't see it exploited much in the wild. So are we going to have a wave of Log4j that wasn't remediated and patched and whatnot coming down the road? Probably. Is there another Exchange vulnerability that's coming? Maybe. I don't know. And I think another thing that organizations can do is having ongoing security monitoring of their systems, whether it's using, a security operations center that's watching, the logs in your environment, or, an EDR product that's watching your systems looking for anomalous activity. And it's not only watching for that activity, it's knowing when to react and when to, start implementing containment steps so that the event doesn't escalate.
Yeah, no, I think that's huge, and really great advice. Um, Luke, this was really fun. Thank you for coming on, telling us what this is like. I'm blown away by how calm you are. I guess you just, uh, and probably serves you well, right? You deal with this in on a daily basis. So, um,
Yeah, Andy, thank you for the opportunity. This has been awesome.
yeah, no, appreciate it.
From the notes of Joe, the security engineer. Monday, 8 a.m. We started recovery. Bastards wanted $800,000 in Bitcoin. Thanks to the hard work and sleepless nights everyone put in, we found a root point of compromise and didn't pay them a dime. All that's left is a long list of clients to call, assuring everyone that this won't happen again. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Cyber Crime Lab, brought to you by DataStream Insurance. When the worst happens, you're going to want the best financial, legal, and technical support to get you back up and running again. With cyber insurance from DataStream, we find the most comprehensive insurance coverage on the market alongside critical post-incident customer support. Go to datastreaminsurance.com today and see how we can help you secure your business data. That's datastreaminsurance.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe and give us a 5-star review. You'll find show notes and any resources mentioned at cybercrimelabpodcast.com. We hope you'll join us next episode. Until then, stay safe. More importantly, stay ready. having a robust security system in place, and an expert with over 15 years of cybersecurity experience on team, you'd think you'd done enough to be safe. Yet as one software service company would soon learn, for the sophisticated criminal, there's no such thing as safe enough.